The afternoon of November 23, 1944, began like any other inside the barbed wire of Camp Clarinda, Iowa. The sky hung low and grey, heavy with the promise of snow. Japanese prisoners shuffled through their morning routines with mechanical precision, roll call, inspection, work detail. They had learned the rhythm of captivity, the strange dance of surviving as enemies on American soil. But what none of them knew, as they swept the barracks floors and hauled firewood through the frozen mud, was that in less than 48 hours, they would witness something that would shatter every belief they had carried across the Pacific. Private Kenji Matsumoto stood near the fence line, his breath clouding in the cold air. He was 22 years old, though his hollow cheeks and the dark circles beneath his eyes made him look older. 4 months earlier, he had been captured on Saipan after his unit was decimated in a night assault. He remembered the chaos, the screaming, the way American flamethrowers had turned the jungle into hell. When dawn came, he found himself one of only 17 survivors from a company of 200 men. Surrender had not been a choice, it had been the absence of all other options. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, standing in the Iowa cold, thousands of miles from home, Matsumoto tried to remember what honor felt like. The propaganda had been clear: death before dishonor, surrender before shame. But he was alive, and that fact gnawed at him every waking moment. Around him, other prisoners moved like ghosts, their eyes distant, their movements careful. They were survivors, yes, but they were also failures at least. That's what Tokyo had taught them to believe. Camp Clarinda held just over 500 Japanese POWs by late November 1944. Most were soldiers captured in the Pacific Theater, though a few were merchant sailors pulled from sunken vessels or pilots shot down over American-controlled waters. The camp itself was unremarkable: rows of plain wooden barracks, guard towers at each corner, a mess hall, an administration building, and a small infirmary. The wire was thick, the floodlights bright, but there was something about the place that felt different from what the prisoners had expected. They had been told Americans were savages, that prisoners would be tortured, starved, humiliated. Yet when they arrived, they were given medical examinations, clean uniforms, and blankets. The food was simple but sufficient: bread, beans, occasional meat. The guards were firm but not cruel. Orders were given in English, translated by a Nisei interpreter who spoke with a strange mix of authority and sympathy. It was all deeply confusing, as though they had stepped into a war that followed rules they didn't understand. Lieutenant Hiroshi Takeda, the senior Japanese officer in the camp, tried to maintain discipline among his men. He held morning meetings in the barracks, reminding them of their duty to the emperor, their obligation to preserve what little honor remained. But even Takeda felt the weight of contradiction. How could they maintain honor in a place where their captors treated them with something resembling decency? How could they reconcile the propaganda they had been fed with the reality of clean water, warm barracks, and guards who rarely raised their voices? One evening, as the men gathered around the stove in Barrack 7, Takeda addressed them quietly. "We are still soldiers of Japan," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his chest. "The war is not over. We must remember who we are." The men listened in silence, but their eyes told a different story. They were tired, they were confused, and deep down, they were beginning to wonder if everything they had been taught was a lie. The days leading up to Thanksgiving passed with the usual monotony: work details, inspections, the cold creeping deeper into their bones. But on the morning of November 22nd, something changed. The camp's atmosphere shifted in subtle ways. The guards seemed more relaxed, almost cheerful. There was laughter from the guardhouse, the smell of baking bread drifting from the mess hall. The prisoners noticed but said nothing. They had learned that silence was safer than curiosity. That afternoon, trucks arrived at the camp gate, their engines rumbling against the quiet. The prisoners watched from the windows as American soldiers unloaded crates and boxes, carrying them toward the kitchen with a kind of urgency that didn't match the usual routine. Matsumoto pressed his face against the cold glass, trying to see what was inside the crates. He caught glimpses of vegetables, sacks of flour, and something else, something large and pale, wrapped in canvas. "What are they doing?" whispered another prisoner, a young man named Hiroshi Yamada who had been captured on Guam. "I don't know," Matsumoto replied, "but it's not normal." That night, the prisoners lay awake, whispering theories. Some thought it was a trap, that the Americans were preparing something cruel. Others believed it was simply a change in rations. A few, like Takeda, said nothing at all, lying in the dark with their thoughts churning. Whatever was coming, they would face it as they had faced everything else since capture, with silence, suspicion, and the faint hope that they might live to see Japan again. But none of them, not even Takeda with all his experience, could have imagined what the next day would bring. The Americans were preparing something. Yes, but it wasn't cruelty. It was something far more disorienting, far more powerful. It was an act of generosity so profound that it would force every man in that camp to confront the limits of everything he thought he knew about war, about enemies, and about what it meant to be human. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning of November 23rd arrived with a brittle cold that made the ground crunch underfoot. The prisoners woke to the usual bugle call, the sound cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a knife. They dressed quickly, their breath visible even inside the barracks, and lined up for roll call in the pale grey light. The guards counted them with the same efficiency as always, their voices clipped and professional. Nothing seemed different, yet everything felt different. After roll call, the men were told there would be no work detail that day. The announcement came through the interpreter, a man in his 30s named Thomas Nakamura, who had grown up in California before the war. "Return to your barracks," he said in Japanese, his accent flawless. "You will be called for. Midday meal." The prisoners exchanged glances. No work detail? It was unprecedented. Suspicion rippled through the ranks. Back in the barracks, the men waited. Some played cards with makeshift decks they had fashioned from paper and pencil. Others sat in silence, staring at the walls or writing letters home that they weren't sure would ever arrive. Matsumoto lay on his bunk, hands behind his head, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger in his stomach. They had been fed breakfast, the usual ration of oatmeal and bread, but it was never enough. Hunger was a constant companion, though not as sharp as it had been in the Pacific, where they had sometimes gone days without food. Around 11 o'clock, the smell began. It started faintly, drifting through the cracks in the barrack walls, barely noticeable at first. Then it grew stronger, richer, carrying with it a scent the prisoners couldn't quite place. It was savoury, almost sweet, with undertones of butter and spice. It filled the air, thick and heavy, impossible to ignore. Men who had been lying down sat up. Those who had been talking fell silent. "What is that?" someone whispered. "I don't know," another replied. "But it smells like—" He couldn't finish the sentence. None of them could. They had no reference point for what they were smelling. In Japan, even before the war, few of them had tasted anything like this. And since the war began, their rations had dwindled to rice, fish when they were lucky, and whatever they could scavenge. The smell coming from the mess hall was unlike anything they had known. At noon, the loudspeaker crackled to life. "All prisoners report to the mess hall," came the announcement in English, followed by Nakamura's Japanese translation. The men rose slowly, pulling on their jackets and stepping out into the cold. They moved in a loose formation toward the mess hall, their eyes wary, their minds racing with questions. When they reached the building, they found the doors, propped open, warm air spilling out into the cold. The guards stood to the sides, rifles slung over their shoulders, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a young corporal with red hair and freckles, nodded as the prisoners filed past. "Happy Thanksgiving," he said quietly, though none of them understood. Inside, the mess hall had been transformed. The usual long tables were still there, but they were covered with white cloths. Plates, forks, and knives were set out in neat rows. And along the back wall, on long serving tables, was more food than most of the prisoners had seen in years. There were bowls of mashed potatoes, steaming and golden with butter, trays of green beans, glistening with what looked like bacon fat, baskets of fresh bread, still warm from the oven, gravy, thick and brown, in metal pitchers, cranberry sauce, bright red and gelatinous, in small bowls, and pies, apple, pumpkin, pecan lined up on a separate table like treasures. But it was the centerpiece that stopped them in their tracks. In the middle of the serving table, on a massive platter, sat a turkey. Not just any turkey, a 50-pound bird, roasted to a deep golden brown, its skin crispy and glistening. It was enormous, almost grotesque in its abundance. Steam rose from its surface, carrying with it the smell that had been tormenting them for the past hour. The prisoners stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak. Some stared at the turkey with wide eyes. Others looked around the room, searching for the trap, the trick, the punishment that surely had to be waiting. A few men's eyes began to water, though whether from the smell, the shock, or something deeper, they couldn't say. Matsumoto felt his chest tighten. He had been hungry for so long, hungry in the jungle, hungry on the ship that brought him to America, hungry even in the camp despite the regular rations. But this wasn't just food. This was excess. This was abundance. This was everything he had been, told Americans hoarded while the rest of the world starved. And now, impossibly, it was being offered to him. Lieutenant Takeda stood at the front of the group, his face carefully neutral. But inside, his mind was reeling. He thought of his wife and daughter back in Yokohama, who were surviving on radish soup and rationed rice. He thought of the soldiers still fighting in the Pacific, gnawing on tree bark and boiling leather belts for sustenance. And here, in front of him, was a feast fit for an emperor. "Please, sit," Nakamura said in Japanese, gesturing toward the tables. His voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "This is Thanksgiving. It is an American holiday. Today, you will eat as we eat." The prisoners moved slowly, hesitantly, toward the tables. They sat down, their movements stiff, their eyes never leaving the food. The guards remained at their posts, watching but not interfering. One of the cooks, a large man in a stained apron, stepped forward with a carving knife and began slicing the turkey. The blade cut through the meat with ease, revealing layers of white and dark meat, moist and tender. He piled slices onto plates, then added scoops of potatoes, beans, and stuffing. When the first plate was handed to a prisoner, a young man named Takashi Ito, who had been captured on Tinian, he didn't move. He just stared at it, his hands trembling. The guard who had given it to him smiled faintly. "Go on," he said in English. He stabbed a piece of turkey, brought it to his mouth, and took a bite. The flavor exploded across his tongue, rich, savory, buttery. He chewed once, twice, then stopped. His eyes filled with tears. He set down the fork and covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. Around the room, other prisoners were having similar reactions. Some ate in silence, tears streaming down their faces. Others couldn't bring themselves to take a bite, staring at their plates as though they were looking at something sacred. A few men wept openly, their sobs cutting through the quiet of the hall. Matsumoto took a bite of mashed potatoes. They were smooth, creamy, salted perfectly. He had never tasted anything like it. He thought of his mother's cooking, of the simple meals she used to make before the war: rice, pickled vegetables, miso soup. This was nothing like that. This was foreign, excessive, overwhelming. And yet, it was also deeply, painfully comforting. Across the table, Takeda ate slowly, his face expressionless. But his hands shook as he cut his turkey, and when he finally looked up, Matsumoto saw something in his lieutenant's eyes he had never seen before. Confusion, yes, but also something like grief. Grief for what they had lost, for what they had believed, for the world that had lied to them. The meal continued in near silence. The only sounds were the clinking of forks against plates, the soft rustle of movement, and the occasional choked sob. The guards watched, their own expressions a mix of satisfaction and unease. They had been told to treat the prisoners fairly, to follow the Geneva Convention, but none of them had expected this raw, unguarded emotion spilling out over a holiday meal. When the meal was over, the prisoners were allowed to return to their barracks. They moved slowly, their stomachs full for the first time in months, their minds reeling. Back in Barrack 7, no one spoke. They lay on their bunks, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, after what felt like hours, Yamada broke the silence. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would they do that?" No one answered. Because none of them knew. The turkey, the potatoes, the pies, it didn't fit with anything they had been taught. Americans were supposed to be monsters. They were supposed to hate. And yet, they had fed their enemies a feast. Matsumoto closed his eyes, but he couldn't stop seeing that 50-pound turkey, golden and glistening, sitting on its platter like a monument to something he didn't understand. Mercy, maybe. Or pity. Or something else entirely, something that made the line between enemy and human being disappear, if only for a moment. That night, as the camp fell into darkness, the prisoners lay awake, full but unsettled. The war was still raging, Japan was still fighting, and they were still prisoners. But something had changed, something fundamental and irreversible. They had been shown abundance in the middle of scarcity, kindness in the middle of war. And now, whether they wanted to or not, they had to reckon with what that meant. The days following Thanksgiving carried a strange heaviness. The prisoners moved through their routines with the same outward discipline, but something beneath the surface had shifted. Conversations that once focused on duty and honor now drifted toward questions no one dared ask aloud. The memory of that 50-pound turkey sat in their minds like an unwelcome guest, impossible to ignore, impossible to reconcile with everything they had been taught. Matsumoto found himself replaying the meal over and over, the weight of the fork in his hand, the taste of gravy mixed with turkey. The way his stomach had felt full, truly full for the first time since leaving Japan. But more than the food itself, he couldn't stop thinking about the faces of the American guards. They hadn't mocked. They hadn't gloated. They had simply watched, some with faint smiles, others with expressions he couldn't quite read. It was as though the meal had meant something to them too, though he couldn't imagine what. In the evenings, when the work details were done and the men gathered in the barracks, the conversations grew more honest. One night, a prisoner named Saburo Taniguchi, a former sergeant who had fought on Guadalcanal, spoke what many were thinking. "I don't understand these Americans," he said quietly, his voice carrying through the dim light of the barrack. "They bomb our cities. They kill our brothers, and then they feed us like honored guests. What kind of enemy does this?" Lieutenant Takeda, sitting on his bunk with his arms crossed, responded carefully. "It is strategy," he said. "They want us weak in spirit, confused. They want us to forget who we are." He had spent weeks analyzing the Americans' behavior, searching for the hidden cruelty, the inevitable betrayal. But it never came. The meals continued. The medical care was consistent. When a prisoner fell ill with pneumonia in early December, the American doctors treated him with the same care they would give their own soldiers. There was no logic to it, at least, no logic that fit the world Takeda had known. Yamada, the youngest of the group, asked the question that hung in the air. What if it's not strategy? What if they actually believe in treating prisoners this way? The room fell silent. The idea was almost too radical to speak aloud. That an enemy could wage war with ferocity and still maintain mercy, it contradicted everything they had been raised to believe. In the Imperial Army, surrender was the ultimate disgrace. Prisoners were weak, shameful, barely human. Yet here, the Americans seemed to operate under an entirely different code, one that said even enemies deserved dignity. Matsumoto lay on his bunk, listening. He thought about the guard who had handed him his plate on Thanksgiving, a young man, probably no older than 25, with tired eyes and a wedding ring on his finger. The guard had looked at him not with hatred, but with something closer to sadness. Or maybe it was pity. Either way, it was human. And that humanity was more disturbing than any cruelty could have been. The weather grew colder as December arrived. Snow fell in thick blankets, covering the camp in white silence. The prisoners were issued warmer coats, wool hats, and gloves, another gesture that confused them. Why? Would captors care if their prisoners were cold? Work details continued, but they were lighter now, mostly indoor tasks like repairing equipment or helping in the kitchen. Some prisoners even began learning basic English from the guards, simple words exchanged during work: cold, snow, coffee, thank you. One afternoon, while chopping vegetables in the kitchen as part of a work detail, Matsumoto found himself standing next to one of the American cooks, the same large man who had carved the Thanksgiving turkey. The cook worked silently for a while, then glanced over at Matsumoto and said something in English. Matsumoto shook his head, not understanding. The cook smiled faintly, then pointed at the knife in Matsumoto's hand and made a cutting motion. "Good," he said slowly. "You're good." Matsumoto nodded, unsure how to respond. Matsumoto stared at it, then slowly took it. "Thank you," he said in broken English, one of the few phrases he had learned. The cook nodded and returned to his work. Matsumoto slipped the chocolate into his pocket, his heart pounding. It was a small gesture, meaningless in the grand scope of the war, but it felt enormous. It felt like a crack in the wall he had built between himself and his captors. That night, he shared the chocolate with Yamada and 2 others in the barrack. They broke it into tiny pieces, letting it melt slowly on their tongues, savouring the sweetness. No one spoke while they ate. When it was gone, Yamada whispered, "Why does kindness hurt more than cruelty?" No one had an answer. As Christmas approached, rumours began circulating that there would be another feast. The prisoners didn't know whether to hope for it or dread it. The last meal had left them emotionally raw, forcing them to confront truths they weren't ready to face. But hunger and curiosity were powerful forces, and when Christmas Day arrived, they filed into the mess hall with the same mix of anticipation and anxiety. This time, they knew what to expect, but it didn't make it any easier. The tables were set with the same care. The food was just as abundant: ham, sweet potatoes, rolls, pies, and once again, a massive turkey, though not quite as large as the Thanksgiving bird. The prisoners sat down, their eyes taking in the spread before them. Takeda, sitting at the head of one table, bowed his head briefly before eating. It wasn't a prayer exactly, but an acknowledgement of something: gratitude, perhaps, or guilt, or simply the weight of being alive when so many were not. Around him, men ate quietly, some with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of grim acceptance. Matsumoto took a bite of ham, then set down his fork. "I cannot do this," he said quietly to Yamada beside him. "I cannot keep accepting their mercy while hating them." Yamada looked at him, his young face etched with confusion. "Then what do we do?" "I don't know," Matsumoto admitted. "But I think we have to stop pretending this isn't real. They are feeding us. They are clothing us. They are keeping us alive. Maybe that doesn't erase the war, but it means something." Across the hall, Sergeant Bill Henderson stood watching the prisoners eat. He had been at Camp Clarinda since it opened, and he had seen the evolution firsthand, the way the prisoners had arrived, broken and suspicious, and how slowly, meal by meal, gesture by gesture, something had softened. He thought about his brother, who was fighting in the Philippines, and wondered if the Japanese treated their prisoners this way. He doubted it. But that wasn't the point. The point was that America had decided to fight differently, to prove that strength didn't require cruelty. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. After Christmas, the camp settled into the long stretch of winter. January and February passed with brutal cold and endless snow. The prisoners worked, ate, and slept, their days blending together in a monotonous rhythm. But beneath the routine, something was changing. Conversations grew longer. Some prisoners began teaching each other skills: how to carve wood, how to write poetry, how to play simple games with stones and sticks. Takeda noticed the change and tried to resist it. "We are still at war," he reminded his men during one evening gathering. "Japan is still fighting. We cannot forget that." But even as he spoke, he felt the futility of his words. How could they stay loyal to an empire that had sent them to die, when their enemy was keeping them alive? How could they cling to propaganda when reality was so starkly different? One night in late February, Matsumoto couldn't sleep. He rose quietly and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered camp. The floodlights cast long shadows across the wire. In the distance, he could see a guard walking his patrol, his breath visible in the cold air. Matsumoto thought about that guard, wondered about his life, his family, his reasons for being here. And for the first time, he realized he no longer saw him as just the enemy. He was a man, doing a job, in a war neither of them had chosen. Behind him, Yamada's voice broke the silence. "Do you think we'll ever go home?" Matsumoto didn't turn around. "I don't know. But if we do, I don't think we'll be the same men who left. Is that good or bad? I don't know that either." Spring came slowly to Iowa. The snow melted, revealing brown earth and the first hints of green. The prisoners were allowed outside more often, permitted to walk the perimeter of the camp under guard supervision. Some began small gardens, planting seeds provided by the camp administration. It was strange, this act of cultivation in a place of captivity. But it gave them purpose, something to care for beyond mere survival. In April, news began filtering through that the war in Europe had ended. Germany had surrendered. The guards celebrated quietly, and the prisoners watched with mixed emotions. They knew what it meant. America could now focus all its resources on Japan. The end was coming, though no one knew when or how. Through the spring and into summer, the rhythm of camp life continued. The prisoners worked in the gardens, helped with maintenance, and attended occasional educational sessions where they learned about American history and government. It was propaganda, yes, but it was also information, and many of them absorbed it hungrily, eager to understand the country that held them. Then, on August 6, 1945, everything changed. The word came through whispers first, then official announcements. A bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. Not an ordinary bomb, something new, something devastating. An entire city destroyed in an instant. 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. The prisoners gathered in stunned silence as the news was translated. Some refused to believe it. Others wept openly. Matsumoto felt something break inside him, not just grief, but a terrible understanding that the world had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The power that had fed them, clothed them, treated them with mercy, was the same power that had just unleashed destruction beyond imagination. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. The announcement came over the camp loudspeaker, in both English and Japanese. The war was over. The prisoners sat in their barracks, unable to process what they were hearing. For years, they had been told Japan could never lose, that the emperor was divine, that death was preferable to defeat. Now, all of it had crumbled. Takeda sat on his bunk, his face in his hands. Around him, men were crying, some with relief, others with despair. Matsumoto felt numb. The war was over, but what did that mean? Were they free? Were they still prisoners? Who were they now, if not soldiers of the emperor? In the days that followed, the Americans handled the situation with the same quiet efficiency they had shown throughout. The prisoners were told they would be repatriated, sent home to Japan. But first, there would be a process documentation, medical checks, arrangements for transport. It would take time. During those final weeks at Camp Clarinda, something remarkable happened. The prisoners and guards, who had spent more than a year in careful, distant coexistence, began to acknowledge each other more openly. Conversations happened, brief and halting, but real. Some guards shared cigarettes with prisoners. Some prisoners helped guards with repairs around the camp, not because they were ordered to, but because it felt right. One afternoon, Matsumoto found himself standing near the fence, looking out at the Iowa countryside. The fields were golden with late summer wheat, the gozah, sky a brilliant blue. Sergeant Henderson approached, standing a few feet away. "You'll be going home soon," Henderson said in English. Nakamura, the interpreter, was nearby and translated. Matsumoto nodded. "Yes, home. I hope you find it the way you left it," Henderson said quietly. "I hope it's not too broken." Matsumoto looked at him, surprised by the sentiment. "Thank you," he said in English. Then, through the interpreter, he added, "You treated us well, better than we deserved." Henderson shook his head. "You're men, that's all. Just men caught in a war." They stood in silence for a moment, two men on opposite sides of a fence, on opposite sides of history, acknowledging the strange bond that had formed despite everything. In late September, the day came for the prisoners to leave. They gathered their few belongings, letters, carved trinkets, worn notebooks, and lined up for the final time. Trucks waited to take them to the train station, where they would begin the long journey back to Japan. As they loaded onto the trucks, Matsumoto took one last look at the camp, the barracks where he had slept, the mess hall where he had eaten that impossible Thanksgiving feast, the gardens they had planted, now heavy with vegetables. It had been a prison, yes, but it had also been something else, a place where his understanding of the world had been shattered and slowly, painfully rebuilt. The trucks rolled through the gates, and Camp Clarinda disappeared behind them. On the train, the prisoners were quiet, lost in their own thoughts. The landscape passed by farms, small towns, cities all untouched by war. It was jarring, this vision of normal life continuing while their own world had been destroyed. The journey to the west coast took days. When they finally boarded the ship that would take them across the Pacific, many of them stood at the rail, watching America recede into the distance. Matsumoto stood with Yamada, both men silent. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" Yamada asked finally. "About how they treated us?" Matsumoto thought about the turkey, the chocolate, the quiet conversations with guards. "I don't know," he said, "but I don't think it matters whether they believe us. We know what happened. We know what we saw." The voyage home was long and rough. The ship was crowded with repatriated prisoners, all of them facing the same uncertain future. When they finally reached Japan in late October, what they found was devastation. Cities were in ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were unrecognizable. Millions were homeless, starving, struggling to survive in a country that had been utterly defeated. Matsumoto made his way to his family's home in Osaka. The neighborhood was mostly rubble, but his mother's house still stood, damaged but intact. When he knocked on the door, his mother opened it, saw him, and collapsed into his arms, weeping. His father, aged and thin, gripped his shoulder without speaking. That night, sitting around, a small brazier with what little food they had, Matsumoto's father asked him about the camp. "Were you treated badly? Did they torture you?" Matsumoto hesitated. How could he explain? How could he tell his father, who had survived air raids and starvation, that the enemy had fed him turkey and given him chocolate? That they had shown him more mercy than his own military had shown its own people? "No," he said finally. "They followed their laws. They treated us fairly." His father nodded slowly, accepting this. But Matsumoto knew he hadn't told the whole truth. The whole truth was too complicated, too painful. The whole truth was that he had been fed by the same hands that had dropped atomic bombs, that he had been shown humanity by people whose government had devastated his country, and somehow he had to live with both realities existing at once. In the years that followed, Matsumoto rarely spoke about his time in Camp Clarinda. Japan was focused on rebuilding, on moving forward, on forgetting the shame of defeat. Returned prisoners were often viewed with suspicion, their survival seen as evidence of weakness or betrayal. It was easier to stay silent, but he never forgot that Thanksgiving meal. The image of that 50-pound turkey stayed with him, golden, abundant, impossible. It became a symbol in his mind, not just of American excess, but of a kind of power he hadn't understood before. The power to show mercy even to those you were destroying, the power to maintain humanity even in the midst of total war. Decades later, when Matsumoto was an old man, his grandson asked him about the war. By then, enough time had passed that the memories felt less raw, less dangerous. He told the boy about Saipan, about the capture, about the camp in Iowa. "And they fed you?" the grandson asked, incredulous. "The Americans fed you well?" "Yes," Matsumoto said. "Better than we fed ourselves. Sometimes. They had a law," they said, "rules about how to treat prisoners, and they followed it." "Why?" the boy asked. Matsumoto smiled sadly. "I asked myself that question every day I was there. I think they wanted to prove something, not to us, but to themselves, that they could be strong without being cruel, that they could win without losing their humanity. Did it work?" Matsumoto thought about the atomic bombs, about the fire bombings of Tokyo, about all the horror that had accompanied that mercy. "I don't know," he said honestly. "War is never that simple. But I know this: when I saw that turkey, when I tasted that food, something in me broke. I couldn't hate them the way I was supposed to. And maybe that was the point." His grandson nodded thoughtfully, and Matsumoto felt a weight lift slightly. He had carried that story for so long, unsure if anyone would understand. But maybe the next generation could see it more clearly, could understand that in the darkest moments of history, small acts of humanity could survive, even flourish. The lesson wasn't that mercy erased violence or that kindness justified destruction. The lesson was simpler and more profound, that even in war, even between the bitterest of enemies, it was possible to remember that the person across the wire was human. That feeding your enemy didn't make you weak, it made you unwilling to surrender your own humanity, even when surrendering it might have been easier. Matsumoto lived to be 87 years old. When he died in 2001, among his possessions was a small, faded photograph he had carried for decades. It showed Camp Clarinda in winter, the barracks covered in snow, smoke rising from the chimneys. On the back, in his careful handwriting, were the words, "Where I learned that mercy is stronger than hate." His family found it when sorting through his belongings, and though they didn't fully understand its significance, they kept it. Because some stories, even when they're not fully told, carry truth that echoes across generations. The story of Japanese prisoners breaking down at the sight of a 50-pound turkey isn't just about food or about Thanksgiving. It's about the moment when everything you believed about your enemy collides with undeniable evidence that they are not monsters, but men. And that collision changes you forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.